Good afternoon. I'm Jim Duff, the Executive Director of the Supreme Court Historical Society. I'm delighted to welcome you today to our virtual platform for the conversation inspired by a recent essay in the Society's Journal of the Supreme Court History by Helen Knowles-Gardner on the impact of Dennis Hutchinson's groundbreaking biography of Justice Byron White and what it had on her career. It's nice to welcome such good friends of the Society to our platform, and it's an honor, special honor to do so today. It's also gratifying to display, in some ways, the results of the Society's support and work to preserve the history of the Supreme Court of the United States. And it's a personal pleasure for me to introduce such good friends of mine. Helen Knowles-Gardner is currently an associate professor of political science at the State University of New York at Oswego. She is leaving academia next week to become the research director at the Institute for Free Speech. She earned her PhD from Boston University, and at Oswego, she taught classes in American law and politics. Her research focuses on legal history. Helen is the author of numerous books, including most recently, Making Minimum Wage, Elsie Parrish versus the West Coast Hotel Company, published in 2021 by Oxford University Press, and recently reviewed in volume 47 of the Journal of Supreme Court History. She is also a past recipient of the Hughes Gossett Student Award, which she won for her outstanding article, her first published article on Lucas versus 44th General Assembly of Colorado. Helen has been a loyal member of the Society's Board of Editors and a previous lecturer in our virtual series. I've known Dennis Hutchinson for almost 47 years. Like Helen, he's inspired me in many ways in my career. Dennis is the William Rainey Harper Professor and the College of Emeritus Senior Lecturer in Law at the University of Chicago. A graduate of Bowdoin College and a Rhodes Scholar, Dennis read for the BA in Law at Oxford and later received an LLM from the University of Texas at Austin. He clerked for 3 federal judges, including Justices Byron White and William O. Douglas, where I first met Dennis. He began his teaching career at Georgetown University Law School, where I also had him as an instructor, and he was indeed inspiring. He then moved to the University of Chicago, to Georgetown's detriment and Chicago's gain in 1981. His books include The Man Who Once Was Whizzer White, a 1998 New York Times notable book, and The Forgotten Memoir of John Knox, co-edited with David Garrow. He teaches and writes in the areas of modern American constitutional history and judicial behavior. Dennis delivered a lecture in the Society's Supreme Court and World War II series. Your moderator today is Professor Tim Huebner, the Irma Sternberg Professor of History and chair and he's also the chair of the Society's Board of Editors. Many of you know Tim, and we welcome him today too. What a delightful collection of friends. They're going to be taking questions from the audience, and you can share your questions in the Q&A box on your Zoom window. And now I'm going to get out of the way and enjoy this, just like I'm sure the rest of you will. Tim, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Jim, and what a pleasure it is to be here today to host this virtual program with 2 fine scholars. It's such an interesting essay that was recently published in volume 48 of the Journal of Supreme Court History by Helen Knowles-Gardner, Supremely Influential: How the Man Who Once Was Whizzer White Shaped My Career. Here is that volume, and we want to spend some time today talking about this essay. Helen, it's so unique. It's an opportunity here for you in this essay to talk a little bit about sort of your work as a scholar and what kind of led you to do what you're doing. So maybe you can tell us about this essay and what prompted you to write it.
Sure, and I would start out by saying a huge thank you to the staff of the Society, because a particular shout out has to go to Jennifer Lowe, because without her prompting, this essay simply wouldn't exist, because I've always known that Dennis's book had a supremely influential impact on my career, but getting that story out to the world and telling people about it and putting it down in print, which really was a labor of love for me. This is an article unlike the standard academic article. Kudos to Jennifer for pushing me to do this. This goes back to, I think, the spring of last year. I put some kind of comment on a tweet on Twitter about Justice White, and I just very vaguely referenced Dennis's book and how influential it had been. And then she kind of pushed me to say, oh, that would make a good contribution to the journal. And maybe then other people might similarly think about writing about influential books on Supreme Court history, and maybe we could make this into some kind of recurring series, in a recurring feature in the journal. So basically that's what prompted it. And the essay gave me an opportunity to reflect on the multifaceted way in which Dennis's book had impacted my career, in terms of legal research, in terms of teaching. I opened the essay with the way in which I always introduce Justice White to my students, or I should say in the past tense now, how I always introduced him to my students. I would always sort of say to them, well, he was a Supreme Court justice, he was an assistant attorney general, deputy attorney general, he's a World War II veteran, and I would go on and on and on. And a Rhodes Scholar, my students were kind of, well, don't know what that is. And I would build it up, and then I would just, as a sort of throwaway, I would say, oh, and he played in the NFL. And boom, all of a sudden I have the students' attention, like, whoa, this is not your usual kind of subject to talk about in the classroom. And so in the essay, I elaborate on that, how it contributed to my teaching, to my research, and also how it really has helped me in terms of networking. So that's what I do. I sort of think about in the essay the way in which it evolved out of my interest in studying legal and constitutional history, and how it became really the starting point for getting my feet wet in the subject matter when I was in grad school.
Thank you. Yes, and I was especially taken by that one passage in the article where you sort of quote Dennis's statement in the prologue, when he talks about participating in the shredding, apparently, of 25 terms of accumulated case files. And you state that you can draw a sort of direct line from reading that passage in his book to your desire to do archival research and the various stages of your academic life. Maybe you can tell us a little bit more about why that passage was so striking to you.
One thing that's really interesting for me, going back and rereading the book in order to write this article, was clearly back at the beginning of my grad school career, I was not quite as enamored with marking up books as I am now. And so really, there were very few annotations in the margins of Dennis's book the first time I read it. But I did notice when I was going back and rereading the book that there was a little exclamation mark next to that passage in the prologue. And that sticks with me today, that passage in the prologue. You know, when I went to graduate school, I had done a small amount of archival research when I was an undergraduate. I majored in American studies, so not history. So going out and doing archival research wasn't the typical thing that somebody studying American studies in England would do. But I wrote my senior thesis on the early years of the politicization of the space program. And I ended up at the Air Force Historical Research Agency in Montgomery, Alabama, going down all sorts of archival rabbit holes, as one does. And once I got to graduate school, I think maybe my second semester, I bought Dennis's book over the winter break of at the end of the very first semester. Second, third semesters, I took a couple of courses on political biography and constitutional theory. And I couldn't turn down the chance to go to the JFK Library, just a short subway ride away from Boston University. And it was like opening up an amazing world. I would put in these request slips and they would bring me all of these boxes with primary archival material. And the thought that White had instructed his clerks to destroy 25 years worth of these treasure troves of information is just something that has really stuck with me. It's something that my mind has kept going back to, particularly because I look at least two of the books that I've written, the book about Justice Kennedy and then the book about West Coast Hotel versus Parrish. Neither of those would exist were it not for quality time spent in archives, particularly at the Library of Congress with lots of different justices' papers. And to think that there's this big void in terms of our knowledge of a particular period in Supreme Court history is just something that has stuck with me.
Thank you. Yes, and I want to turn to Dennis now. Dennis, how did you learn about Helen's essay? And were you surprised when you heard that your book, especially this passage that we've been talking about, had such an impact?
I heard about her essay from Jennifer Lowe, who said, oh, by the way, you might be interested in an article that we've accepted to be published in the next volume of the journal. And she described it to me. And of course, I was deeply flattered, but extremely curious. Yeah, I wrote the book for my reasons. I thought I did a fairly thorough job with what I had. And as the passage you both have referred to points out, there was a lot I didn't have. So I was intrigued. And when I read a draft of the essay, I was very impressed.
That's great. And I mean, just thinking about your book, I mean, Helen in her article points out that only about a quarter of your book on Justice White, and of course I have a copy here, The Man Who Once Was Whizzer White, actually focuses on his work as a justice, but she characterizes it still as a judicial biography. And I'm wondering if you could talk a little bit about how you wrote the book and why you wrote it in the way that you did.
I wrote the book because I thought he had lived a remarkably interesting life, which the first two paragraphs of Helen's essay emphasized. And secondly, I didn't want him to get away with what his current project had been, and that was to shoo away biographers, journalists, and what he liked to call snoops, which for him was a very broad category, from telling about this remarkable life. So the combination of that desire with some insight into White himself and my deep frustration with the Brethren, which had come out in 1979,
Right.
Impelled me to try to tell a story and do it right and do it with footnotes. Because the terrible problem with the Brethren, which got discussed over and over again after it came out, is there's no direct source quotation. it's impossible to cross-examine the sources. And as anyone knows, and the two of you, of course, given the work that you've done, know well, you really want to know who the testimony is coming from and what they're basing it on. And I vowed that to the extent that I could do it, anything that I cited and anything that I quoted, I could document with a contemporaneous note and would be able to identify down the line. So it was an exercise both in storytelling and in biographical historiography.
And for those who haven't read the biography and who maybe don't know much about Justice Byron White, how would you summarize his life and his work, and especially what made his sort of life story so interesting and so unique?
We pay attention to him today because he was the first of two appointments to the Supreme Court by President John Kennedy. And he sat on the court for 31 years. He wrote a number of important decisions. He wrote a number of famous and rather blistering dissents, including one in Roe versus Wade, for which he's always remembered. And he wrote the majority opinion in Bowers versus Hardwick, which was the court's first encounter with the asserted right of gays to be constitutionally protected. But what makes him fascinating to me is that he came from, as we like to say these days, from abject poverty. He grew up in the sugar beet fields of north central Colorado. And because of his high school grades, he won a full tuition scholarship to the University of Colorado. And while he was there, he not only graduated Phi Beta Kappa, but he became on some lists an All-American and finished second in the Heisman Trophy, the second Heisman Trophy voting with respect to college football. And he went from there to a Rhodes Scholarship. And when he won the Rhodes, he was also drafted by the Pittsburgh Steelers, as they called themselves in those days. We know them by a different name now. And the Rooney organization offered him what at that time was the highest salary in professional football, just over $30,000 a year. And he felt, given that his older brother, who coincidentally was also a Rhodes Scholar, needed the money for his graduate studies in medicine, he felt he had to turn down the Rhodes and accept the football contract. So friends appealed to the Rhodes trustees. And for the first time, and at that point, they're more or less 3-decade history, granted him a deferral. So he played for what we would call the Pittsburgh Steelers in the fall, and then matriculated at Oxford at the beginning of the next term. He only spent 2 terms in Oxford, however, because the war broke out. And Oxford sent all of the Americans home. So he came on home, went to Yale Law School, played 2 more years of professional football. He'd been traded to the Detroit Lions, and so he played out his career with the Lions. He ended up graduating at the top of his class at Yale Law School, and went on to clerk for Chief Justice Fred Vinson. And after his clerkship, he returned to his home state, Colorado, and practiced law in Denver from the late 40s until the Kennedy campaign began, where he worked for John Kennedy. And when Kennedy was elected, he was made Deputy Attorney General. So he'd had not exactly the run-of-the-mill CV of a Supreme Court justice or even a high official in the Department of Justice. And he's worth remembering for the combination of choices that he made in terms of service to family, service to country, and so on. Now, in saying that, the last thing in the world I'd want to do is to put him on some sort of a pedestal, because I can imagine him climbing out of the grave and wringing my neck, because the last thing that he ever wanted was adoring publicity. And that I tried to avoid completely in what I wrote.
Very good. Thank you. Yes, very important justice, as you said, serving for 31 years from 1962 to 1993. Helen, I want to go back to you. One of the main points of your essay seems to be that judges are complicated figures, and White was certainly a complex individual and couldn't be labeled so easily. Was White just sort of unique in this way? Or can you say more about why the terms liberal and conservative are not especially helpful when applied to Supreme Court justices? This is one of the observations that you make in your essay. Maybe you could talk a little bit more about that.
Sure. So when I went to graduate school, I wasn't at all aware that there were kind of different schools of thought, different methods of analysis for law and courts. You know, when I went to graduate school, I thought I was going to focus on Congress. And it took one semester of a wonderful professor teaching me constitutional law to realize, no, wrong branch of the government. I was going to be focusing on the judiciary instead. And when I read Dennis's book, as I say, I still wasn't really aware of these different types of qualitative and quantitative schools of thought and schools of analysis. And so Dennis's book appealed to me on a sort of very basic level that, of course, human beings are complex. Of course, judges are complex. And I think I spent my entire academic career sort of embodying that thought in my writing and my research. I have great respect for my law and courts colleagues who do quantitative analysis, and I can see some role that it could play even in the study of law and courts. But at the end of the day, I think there's a problem with reducing human behavior to ones and zeros. Now, ones and zeros or two. Now, one is conservative. You code somebody as conservative, they're a one. You code them as a two, they're a liberal. But that presupposes that we can all agree on what liberal is or conservative is. And I've never believed that there is one definition of liberal, one definition of conservative. And I think this is really important to keep in mind with regards to the study of constitutional history. Because, as we know, the study of history is the study of continuity and change over time. And just like other things which either stay the same or change over time, people's perceptions and understandings of those labels, liberal and conservative, have changed over time. One of the things that Dennis's book pushed me to do, with the sort of convenience of having the JFK Library just down the road, was to do more research into the Kennedy presidency and the appointments, the Supreme Court and federal judicial appointments by President Kennedy. And it became very clear to me that what people understood as a Kennedy liberal looks very different to what we might understand as a liberal today. And so I think those are such amorphous terms that, to a certain degree, even if we look at a particular Supreme Court justice and maybe default to an assumption, well, they're a conservative justice or they are a liberal justice, at the end of the day, they may not be as complex as Justice Byron White was, but nevertheless, I just don't think that it's appropriate to put any of those justices in a liberal or conservative box. I think that just way oversimplifies, and I think at the end of the day also way excessively politicizes the study of Supreme Court history.
Thank you for that. And to just follow up on that point, one of the observations that you make toward the end of the essay is not only did Dennis's book kind of set you on a path of wanting to go into the archives, but also you end up saying that this book helped to teach you lessons about the Supreme Court appointment process and about the institution itself. So maybe you could say a little bit more about that.
Yeah, I think this question really builds on your previous one, and I kind of alluded to that with my reference to President Kennedy's 2 appointments to the court. So whenever I was teaching the Supreme Court or teaching constitutional law, and we came up to the week or the 2 weeks when we would discuss the Supreme Court appointments process, although I had taken a very historical approach to the subject matter, it was increasingly becoming clear that the students were coming into this discussion with a sort of a default assumption about how the Supreme Court appointments process works. To them, increasingly, my students were all born in the 21st century. And so they look at the appointments process, and to them, there's only one reason that a president nominates somebody to sit on the Supreme Court. And they would say to me, well, it has to be for purely political, partisan reasons. The only reason you would nominate somebody to be on the Supreme Court is to push the court in one particular direction to achieve a particular political goal, to sort of achieve an extension of why the president thinks that he or she was elected, what sort of political goals to achieve. And I increasingly found that my students were just conditioned to assume that that was the only reason that somebody would nominate somebody to fill the Supreme Court. What I tried to do in this essay is to show one of the ways in which Dennis's book has kind of helped me to explain to the students that it's not always like that. It hasn't always been like that in history, and that we maybe need to take a more nuanced evaluation of the process. And that's really how the JFK Library research that I referred to earlier helped me. When I went into those archives, presented with all of these wonderful boxes of information, I basically emerged with a couple of different projects. One of which was the article that Jim referred to at the beginning, which was my first published article in the Society's Journal about Lucas versus Colorado. But then the other project, which never came to published fruition until this article that we're talking about today, was the research I'd done looking at the differences between JFK's 2 appointments to the Supreme Court, both in 1962, just a few months apart, and what the article then allowed me to do with that research is I didn't do much, I didn't put much discussion in the essay of the nomination and appointment of White, because Dennis has written extensively about that and didn't seem to be much point in retreading that territory. But what it did do was allow me to say, well, White, as Dennis quite clearly shows in his book, was essentially a shoo-in for that first nomination. A lot of people within the Kennedy administration had White right at the top of their list right from the beginning. And he then, as I point out in the essay, doesn't fit your mold of we need someone on the court to pursue a specific political agenda. By contrast, the other nomination later in 1962, when Felix Frankfurter leaves the court, Kennedy then sees an opportunity to replace Felix Frankfurter with somebody who's a much more solidly predictable liberal vote, i.e. Arthur Goldberg. So when you contrast these
liberal vote to be sure, but Jew replacing Jew, since there had been a Jewish seat now for more than a generation, and somebody identified with labor. That was a constituency that the Democratic Party at that time wanted to rely on, and this is a way of saying this is who we stand with. So he was a twofer. He wasn't a shoo-in, but he certainly was a twofer from their standpoint. White, on the other hand, as we've discussed, was, well, we got to have somebody who's the perfect symbol of the new frontier. Intelligent, accomplished, athletic, committed to public service, perfect. And there's, as I point out in the book, and as I know Helen remembers, there was a little flurry at some point of, well, we could do something really radical and appoint an African-American. And the Whizzer councils and the Kennedy insiders said, no, that's too soon. We can't do that. But that's a part of the story. So I'm sorry to interrupt, but.
No, I have no problem with you interrupting, Dennis. And one of the things that our comments, if you put them together, he just emphasizes that these appointments have been in the past and will continue to be in the future much more complex than a lot of people studying this subject matter sort of default to the assumption, well, it's all political.
I think you make a very important point, Helen, that's worth underscoring. Different presidents take different views of Supreme Court appointments. Some certainly, as we've seen in recent years, are pushing an overt political agenda. I mean, we can't deny the last three appointments to the Supreme Court are a function of that. On the other hand, you can take somebody like Harry Truman. He just appointed his poker playing buddies from the Senate or the cabinet, including one Republican. He didn't care about ideology, and they sometimes voted against him. Eisenhower's more complex. George H.W. Bush, well, he wanted to get the position filled. The same thing was true of W. Abner Mikva made an interesting remark to me after he left the White House counselship after his lengthy career in Congress. He said one of the things that frustrated him is that President Clinton viewed the question of Supreme Court appointments as a political challenge more than a political opportunity. That is, I've got to get 51 votes. How do I get 51 votes in this Senate? So not only are there different questions by different presidents of ideology, there are also different political questions as to what is the cost or what is the benefit of a particular appointment that I make. But I think that's a great theme that I think you're emphasizing, Helen.
We are in the middle of a fascinating conversation here with two scholars, Helen Knowles-Gardner, who's the author of an article in volume 48 of the Journal of Supreme Court History. Her article is about Dennis's book on Justice Byron White, and we welcome your questions as we continue this conversation. Dennis, I want to give you a chance to talk about your experience as a clerk, and especially how that experience of clerking for Justice White affected how you wrote the book. In the prologue, you basically say that White sort of, as you put it, left you on your own, and that he made it clear that he was not authorizing this in any way. Wanted to give you an opportunity to talk a little bit more about that issue.
After I signed a contract with Simon & Schuster to do the book, I thought as a matter of courtesy, I should notify the justice. And so I made an appointment, and he said, "What are you here for?" And I said, "Well, I just, as a matter of courtesy, think it's important for you to know that I've agreed to write a judicial biography of you." And his response was to take that massive right hand of his, say, "The hell you say?" And I said, "Yeah, that's what's going to happen." And so he kind of composed himself and said, "Well, I won't help, but I won't get in the way either." And that was an enormous benefit. The problem with authorized biographies or approved biographies is you're responsible to dozens of editors, first the family, and then knowledgeable friends. And fortunately, he told his family and knowledgeable friends not to get in the way, which led to some amusing interactions when I talked to someone in Denver saying, "Oh, you're right, that's great to have a story. Byron's led an interesting life. And I assume your book has his blessing." And I'd say, "No, not at all." "Oh, well, I don't know whether I should talk to you. The Wrath of Byron White. I don't know." Most people came around because they thought it was an interesting story. They knew about his hostility to the press and to his story being told, which, as I delineate in the book, it really stemmed from his college days when he played in the first NIT, National Invitational Basketball Tournament. And there were reporters climbing into his hotel room, looking under his bed and doing stuff like that. And for somebody who had grown up in hard scrabble Wellington, Colorado, and that was just too much. So I was on my own and happily on my own, and I thought it made it in the end a better book.
And we're starting to get some questions. One question is from Jim Duff, who wants to come back on camera. So Jim, come on back.
Thank you, Tim. I neglected to mention you're at Rhodes College, so when I was describing your background, so I'll do that now. And thank you for all the great work you do on our board. A quick point to make about something that Dennis just mentioned in passing. Justice White was such a great athlete, and you did focus on his football career, but he played in the national championship. He was a guard on the University of Colorado basketball team too, and played in the national championship game in the NIT, which in those years was the predecessor of the NCAA for championships. So quite a well-rounded athlete as well. The question I had was, what can we do to inspire more young scholars to go into your field? Helen, you were inspired by Dennis, as was I. And in conjunction with that, just how important is it for preserving the history of the Supreme Court that we encourage young scholarship.
Who wants to take that first?
Helen, you're the one who belongs on center stage here.
Well, I think it's Dennis's book that belongs on center stage, but okay, I'll go first. I think it's incredibly important to, even though I'm about to leave academia, I still think that the same principles that I'm going to take to my life beyond academia will still apply, that this should be, if you're interested in constitutional history, I go back to something I've said a couple of times, that history is the study of continuity and change over time. And you really can't understand constitutional law and constitutional theory today without thinking about those different arcs of change and continuity over time. And I would say that one really good way to get a handle on this stuff is to read as many judicial biographies as you can, and to pick up biographies, judicial biographies of figures that you may not necessarily find yourself agreeing with, because there's still going to be a lot for you to learn with this stuff. I distinctly remember that maybe 2 or 3 months after I finished devouring Dennis's book, I then picked up a copy of Gerald Gunther's biography of Learned Hand. And it was the same kind of opening all sorts of windows to learning about those different ebbs and flows over time.
Yes.
Well, I think that's right. I think one point that Helen makes in her essay is that the sort of work that I've done and that she has done showed the complexity of human behavior in a position of power that is not ratified at a ballot box. Once you get confirmed, unless you do something really heinous to get impeached, and it's never happened to a Supreme Court justice, you're in an intellectual free fire zone. And I think the more examples you see of men and women who have confronted that, the better you understand how the institution itself operates. I mean, they're wonderful biographies. Joan Biskupic seems to turn one out every other year. But also going back, J. Woodford Howard's biography of Frank Murphy is a splendid piece of work. Sidney Fine wrote multiple volumes on Murphy. I was first taken with the idea of judicial biography as a window into constitutional development with Alpheus T. Mason's great biography of Harlan Fiske Stone, published in 1956. And when it came out, quoting internal working papers of the Supreme Court, one traditional legal scholar after another said, this is the end. They'll never be able to talk to each other privately. This has destroyed collegiality at the Supreme Court. And it seems like every year, more or less, since 1956, somebody writes a column saying collegiality has been destroyed at the Supreme Court. Well, there's recently the leak of Samuel Alito's draft opinion in Dobbs or something else like it. No, collegiality is not destroyed. One, collegiality is overstated. It may be that the justices really operate, as Justice Powell once said, as 9 little law firms with very little interaction other than once a week meetings in a conference room. They get their work done. And the question is, what do they bring to the task of getting it done? And that's what this sort of work that I've tried to do, that Helen has done, tries to illuminate and to break out of this notion, as you've emphasized, Tim, well, presidents only make appointments for political reasons, or justices can be categorized as liberal or conservative. Ridiculous. White said to me once when I was clerking, well, I suppose you want to put me on a Quinn Martin index, with a sneer. And he actually knew his Quinn Martin number, just to show you that he had taken seriously enough the metric categorization of his views, but it explains nothing. So, you know, I'm just bless Helen for what she's done, and thank her for her attributions.
Absolutely, absolutely. We do have a question for you, Dennis, about what it was like to clerk for both Justices White and Douglas. Maybe you could talk about those experiences, how they compared to one another.
It's a trick question for this reason. I clerked for Douglas in a nominal sense the first full year of his retirement. He was entitled to have one professional staff because he was editing the second volume of his memoirs, and he was cataloging his papers for the Library of Congress. And he wanted, and I think the court wanted, when I say the court, I mean Chief Justice Berger, wanted some sort of professional input in the categorization, so that this massive archive that he ended up donating would have some coherence to the finding aid and the location of materials. But because he was retired, and for the reason he was retired, which was a severe stroke, he was not 100%, to say the least. And there were times, I regret to say, when he would ask me to call him a cab so he could go to the airport. It just wasn't going to happen. There were other times when he was scary in his intellectual retention and analysis. Well, if you'll take volume 352 off the shelf, I think it's in my dissenting opinion where I say X, Y, and Z, and sure enough, you do it. So you had to be on your toes as much or more than if I were clerking for somebody who was at the height of his powers. And frankly, he wanted a companion. He wanted somebody to talk to. He wanted somebody to be able to go to lunch with at the Monocle and relive old times. So it was two entirely different experiences, but for me, enriching in both cases.
Thank you. Here we have a question about the nature of judicial biography, and I'm going to throw this one to you, Helen. Is it an assumption of judicial biography that a judge's decisions can be explained or understood according to their previous life experiences? Actually, this is something that you write about in your essay. So why don't you talk about that a little bit?
Gosh, what a big question.
Yes.
I think I would start out by saying it really depends on the individual you're talking about. But I think if you sort of take a step back from the "it depends" answer, I cannot see any decision that is being made by a justice as not being influenced in some shape or form by their background. And I think that that's not just applicable to justices, and I think it's applicable to all of us. Every single decision we make is in some shape or form influenced by our background. I could point to specific examples but I'm not going to because I don't want to get into specific cases. But when I was writing about Justice Kennedy, there was, without a shadow of a doubt, certain cases that were deeply impacted by people he'd met in the past, aspects of his education, aspects of his life growing up in Sacramento. And so I think ultimately the answer to the person's question is absolutely, these decisions may not always be influenced by somebody's background to the same extent, but nevertheless, a person's background is going to shape the way in which they perceive the information presented to them for a particular case.
I'd add another factor. I think that's dead right. I'd add another factor, and that's the local context of the decision-making process. If you're in a room full of people who have one particularized view of this aspect of the world, and you grew up with a totally different one, you may dig in. Having put it that way, the most obvious example is, and Justice O'Connor was very good about articulating this, was having Justice Marshall in the conference room when discussions of racial discrimination and the subtleties as well as the outrages of racial discrimination occurred. You know, she wrote very movingly, he educated us. You know, it had to be different with Thurgood Marshall in the room. It had to be different with Ruth Bader Ginsburg in the room talking about discrimination against women. So context can shade, expand, contract the effect of life experience on the framing of the issue, let alone the resolution of it.
Thank you. Yeah, just looking at a few of the other questions that are coming in here as we head into our final segment here of our virtual program today. Dennis, this is a question for you. You have shared what inspired you to write about Justice White, but was there a sort of broader aha moment that prompted you to go into legal history in the first place, similar to what Helen has been talking about here?
I don't know. I suppose to some extent it was my frustration with the brethren. You know, that life is more complex than this, because I'd lived through one of the terms, the final term that they cover in their book. And I recognized some of it. I didn't recognize other parts of it. I doubted some. I recognized some law court gossip that I had doubted at the moment that was being reported with the same factual authority as everything else. And I had the luxury of teaching at Georgetown, which, like Helen's subway ride away from the Kennedy Library, is a nice long one zone cab ride or good long walk from the manuscript division of the Library of Congress. And so I decided, well, what can I find there? I found the Harold Burton papers, and Burton was the original Supreme Court pack rat. And I learned an enormous amount about cases that I thought I understood. And I thought, there's something that can be done with this archive. And so that resulted in my first major essay, which was in 1979, the same year the Brethren was published, on decision-making in the Supreme Court from 1954 to 1958. That is how unanimity was achieved in racial discrimination cases. And I just found enormously fascinating stuff, including the first draft of Bowling versus Sharp, the DC companion case to Brown and the Board. And I made a photocopy of it. I was allowed to make one. And I showed it to Justice Thurgood Marshall, who I wanted to interview for the essay, of course. And he held it up and he said, "Is this real? Did Warren really write this? Are you kidding me?" Because the first draft of Bowling versus Sharp declares that education is a fundamental right, which Marshall had been litigating for much of his career. I won't tell you what he said he wanted to do with the draft opinion, but he did want to have a conversation with Justice Powell about it, because Justice Powell had written San Antonio Independent School District versus Rodriguez, which had said education is not a fundamental right. So incidents like that just stoke the fires.
If I might just jump in and add something, something that Dennis said about the wonderful papers at the Library of Congress sort of just spurred me to jump in here and add something to my answer about sort of like the importance of judicial biographies and things. For undergraduates and graduates out there who are focusing on this sort of subject matter or are thinking about studying constitutional history or history of the Supreme Court, if you can find the resources and have the time, I would say go in and do this primary archival research, even if it's only in the archives of your home institution library. If they have a special collections department, go in and sort of get your hands on some of this material. And if you're looking to if you then have the resources to go to the Library of Congress, wow, the manuscript room is just a wonderful place to spend some quality time researching. I was there most recently over spring break in March for 10 days, and the room was filled with a small army of undergraduate research assistants that a professor had brought with him. And they were all working through the Brennan papers and the recently released Justice Stevens papers. And part of me was thinking I couldn't trust a small army of undergraduates to scan the right things. But then the other part of me was thinking how wonderful it was that these young people were getting involved with the material. Even if I did hear them, a couple of them in the corridor outside saying, "The Justice Brennan papers smell." And the other person said, "Well, that's because they're really old." And I was like, okay, that's maybe perhaps not the best reaction, but hey, they're getting involved with this material. They're sort of seeing how this process of coming to decisions in Supreme Court cases really works.
One of my former students, Ross Davies, who teaches at the Antonin Scalia Law School, actually runs a course where the students are required to develop a topic and research it using the collection of the manuscript division. So they actually do real live archival legal history research on the court, which I think is a terrific use of proximity by a very imaginative scholar.
Very good. Well, this has been a wonderfully rich and interesting conversation here today. We've not been able to get to all of our questions, but I do just want to say that the granddaughter of Justice White, Emily Lippy, wrote just to say hello and thank you. So it's wonderful to know that family members of the justices, or at least of Justice White, part of our virtual audience here today.
I remember when Emily's mother was in high school and writing a term paper and telling me that I should work harder because her daddy would sometimes come home green at night from all that he had to do. So props to the Lippy family across the board.
That's great. That's great. Thank you. Thank you. It has, as I said, it has been such a pleasure to be able to host this conversation today with Helen Knowles-Gardner, Dennis Hutchinson, and to talk about Helen's article on Dennis and Dennis's book, The Man Who Once Was Whizzer White. Quick reminder for our audience that a survey link will be sent out after the program, and it's always the case after each of our programs. There is a survey link. So when you get that link, please do respond. We want to make our programs as interesting to our members and to the general public as we possibly can. The next issue of the Journal of Supreme Court History will be hitting mailboxes soon, so be on the lookout. That will be volume 48, number 2. And you can always visit the Society's website at www.supremecourthistory.org for updates about the Society's upcoming events and links to our past and virtual events. And with that, we are adjourned. Thanks to you both.
Thank you.
Thank you.